There we go. We should be live now. I am having a problem seeing our videos, so if anybody else is live and you can see our videos, please either put a comment on the chat on the right hand side or in our Slack channel. It's probably just a little bit of a technical problem that I'm having on my end, but let's go past that. So welcome everybody. This is the second episode of the weekly supervised show. Today I actually have two good news. So number one is that my partner in crime, Amber, is finally with us. So she had to miss the first episode because she was flying, but now she's here. The second thing is that this is no longer a panel conversation. So I got a lot of feedbacks on the first episode that we had too many people with a very small amount of time to go too deep into conversations. So today we have Albert, who is our esteemed guest, and we're going to talk about what he's been doing with his company in the past couple of years. So I would pause there. I would let Amber introduce herself a little bit, and then we could also ask Albert to give us a brief introduction about himself and the work that he's been doing in the past couple of years. And also maybe Albert, feel free to tell everybody in the audience that how you and I know each other, so we're no longer in the shadows. Brilliant. All right, off to you, Amber. Likewise.
Completely against programming after that. They were thinking like we should focus on school, and there's not really a path forward for technology. And look at me now, Dad. Just kidding. But eventually, I ended up going to product management shortly after my undergrad at Western, where I did computer science and medical science. Mostly because of the fact that I didn't feel confident in my software engineering abilities, and I loved what product management was, kind of figuring out the requirements and actually building a product and prioritizing that. And then shortly after that, I did a Master of Information System Design at U of T, which is basically like learning how to draw diagrams, workflow process diagrams, every possible diagrams, lots of fun. And that's where Hypercare came out of.
Brilliant. So it's good. That's good. I think that was a very brief yet full of information kind of an introduction. So maybe that could be a good segue for us to get into Hypercare. So tell us a little bit about what Hypercare does. Basically, give us the sales pitch, and also if you feel like it, let us know a little bit about how your organization is supporting Canadians or North Americans if you've grown into that market, specifically, in these challenging times in the COVID era.
Yeah. So I think to start off around Hypercare, how it kind of started. It all started because I did 2 courses in computer science at University of Toronto. One of them really interesting. Both of them are really interesting. One of them you get to learn how to build a business of a company, and the other portion you actually ship out the product. And so through that course, that year was healthcare themed. So we had a bunch of doctors as mentors, and a lot of them were complaining from different angles. One of them was talking about how everyone's using WhatsApp. And then from another angle, they were like talking about how pagers, which I've never heard of before in my life, didn't even know how it looked like, was still being used in healthcare, and it created a lot of frustrations. And I really got passionate once I started shadowing doctors. And kind of to summarize why pagers are so frustrating is that you only have one number to call back. So every time someone pages you, there's just essentially one number, you pick up the phone and you call them. And so as you can probably imagine, clinicians who are super, super busy, unfortunately, it's very difficult for them to really connect quickly and understand how important the issue is. So triaging workflow is difficult. And so I got very passionate in solving the problem. I thought, why don't we just build WhatsApp for healthcare? And I quickly realized how difficult healthcare was. Here I am now. We essentially allow clinicians to figure out who is on call at the hospital, so who the surgeon on call is, and quickly connect, directly be able to do clinical messaging. And we have evolved to be a very comprehensive platform. So we have like pager duty like experiences where if someone's not responding, we'll go up the chain. We also allow them to fan out clinical alerts. So if someone has COVID, for example, and I'll touch a little bit about how we've been able to help COVID, but if someone has COVID, for example, we actually alert the doctor and the infectious disease team if the patient's deteriorating. So it has really become a very comprehensive platform, not just connecting 2 doctors together. So it's been really cool to see that. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's an awesome introduction into what your company does, also how you guys got there. But I'm kind of curious, like digging deeper into that. So, you talked about how you started with the idea, but what did you actually do when you got the idea? How did you proceed? I know you mentioned that you had done some research before, then you were in product, but how did you actually go about building it out? I know you mentioned healthcare is kind of it's kind of difficult to navigate through a lot of the procedures in it. So what was the process like?
Yeah, I had no background. I don't have any family or friends at that point that was physicians yet. And so it was very difficult for me to understand the workflow. And I have never even used a pager in my personal life. So it was also very difficult to understand the workflow around that. And so one of the things that I think this is where, research is really applicable for building a company, is to invest yourself as deep as possible into the problem. So for me, I was able to thankfully shadow clinicians. I even went on 30-hour call shifts with trauma surgeons. I got to see people who got hit by cars. And I really understood what the workflow was, even slept at the hospital. And so I was able to see how the pagers work. I actually was able to borrow a pager from the hospital. I was also able to be part of the WhatsApp group. So I knew the workarounds that people were working on as well, understood the reason why behind that. And throughout this journey, I made I would say hundreds of connections with physicians, and a lot of them are my friends, and not just physicians, nurses, allied health workers. And I think that's really, really important to understand deeply about the problem itself.
So I'm curious, Albert, when you say borrow, was that legally or?
Legally, yeah. I think what's really interesting about healthcare, and what's also really challenging about healthcare, is it's a place where there's a lot of puzzle pieces, a lot of different people. And I would say one of the reasons why healthcare costs has only kept going up, while the delivery of care and care quality hasn't really gone up significantly, and some people argue it has gone down, is that not a lot of people understand the big picture. Everyone understands a little piece of their own picture. And so even as innovator, it's really difficult to understand the problem when the physician just why can't we use something like WhatsApp? And then you have switchboard operators who are connecting clinicians together, but clinicians don't know what exactly happens on the other end. And how do they know who's on call? And so everyone has a little piece of the puzzle, and it takes a while to understand it. So I was able to also shadow switchboard operators, for example, and some of them were kind enough to lend me some pagers too. And I was able to learn, for example, pagers, when you page it, it takes about 30 seconds for that pager to go off. So not something you would probably know until you have a pager. But I was surprised by that because it's only a phone number. I was imagining it would be instant because there's such low information that gets communicated. But I think those are things that's important, is like figuring out all the different stakeholders and making sure you understand exactly what they're thinking about success and failure for the workflow. Yeah.
So you talked a little bit earlier about kind of just the type of work that you were doing day to day, and also just what it actually takes to build a startup, and also just like an awesome company that's doing meaningful work like Hypercare. But can you tell us a bit more about the different hats that you were wearing at your startup to this day? Like, what are the different types of roles that you had to take on? And could you describe each of those in language that you would have understood when you were like in school, in case we have like other viewers here who are like just starting out or like are inspired by your journey?
Yeah, of course. I think I was thinking about how to phrase this. I think I'll probably start with something that was very confusing for me for a long time, in terms of like, what does a CEO do? And for a long time I just thought like CEO like just basically made the decision at the end of the day and get to claim all the rewards, get to claim all the good things, and then blame others for all the negative things that happen. But I kind of realized what a CEO does is, and at some point everyone's career is all about sales. And I think as engineers, as researchers, we're not very comfortable with the sales portion, but it's really important for the sales portion too. Even as clinicians, like you're trying to sell on a treatment plan, and if you don't follow your treatment plan, they may come back to the hospital, for example. And so in the case of CEO, I would say you're selling to your employees why they should stay and not take a job that's 3 times paying more, that has more time for their friends and family. You're selling to investors why invest in you, other than like 1,000 other entrepreneurs out there, especially when you're from Toronto and there's a lot of sexy Silicon Valley companies as well. You're selling to your parents why you're not taking a better job and you're working on your own startup. You're selling to yourself, like you have a lot of opportunities out there, why are you doing this, right? And so a lot of it is around the sales portion as a CEO, keeping everyone motivated and making sure you have enough resources so the company moves forward, and making sure you also have hired the right person in the different types of roles that you have in your company. And it makes it very challenging too, because as the company starts off, you might be focused on building a product because you don't know what exactly to build and what the problem is. But as a company scales, it could be like, how do we scale sales and marketing? And you gotta put different people in there. And then as you get bigger and bigger, you're gonna have the best person in a particular subspecialty in that role. And so your role basically evolves as the company grows, but you essentially touch a lot of different places, in the different cycle of the company.
So this got me curious. So 2 things. One, when you talked about the pager and the 30-second delay, that was, I think, a gateway for us to have a conversation about data. So the audience that we have is very data heavy. So probably at the end, when we have more time, if we have more time, we'll get back to the data aspects of Hypercare specifically. But for the different roles that you said that you've played, I'm sure one of them at some point, maybe not anymore, but at some point it has been product management, probably very early on. So, for us, let's say if you were to put it in a very kind of layperson's term, how would you describe, from the perspective of, or the experience of somebody who's recently built a startup from the grounds basically into making revenue, how do you describe, let's say, the different stages? So I'm sure you started with prototyping, and then you had to build some sort of an MVP at some point, and then go into production and scale and so on and so forth, which are all, so to speak, maybe not necessarily the responsibilities of a product manager, but a product manager is involved in all of those stages. And again, because I know that you probably have had that hat on at some point, or maybe even until today, I think you'd be the best person to tell us about all that journey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say, if you want to categorize by funding rounds, like people might be familiar with those terminologies, like you have pre-seed, seed, Series A, Series B, Series C, and things get muddied and things get changed in terms of terminology, but this is kind of terminology that people use right now. So pre-seed is focusing on making sure, A, is there a problem out there? And then B, is there a problem that people actually care about? And so what you're trying to validate here is like, there's a problem, and then you're trying to build a solution that people actually care about. So people are actually downloading and using an application. If you can charge money and people are paying for it, that's ideal. But it's not a necessary requirement to actually figure out whether or not you can actually capture the value, right? People talk about, you deliver the value and you also have to figure out how to capture the value, right? Very similar to WhatsApp. WhatsApp provides a ton of value, doesn't really capture a ton of value because they don't really charge people money, so they're not really capturing that portion too. So really focusing on that portion. And during that portion, as founders, you're really interviewing as many people as possible that, people talk about this. Don't just stay at home and build something. It's actually going out, talking to people who have this problem, understanding deeply about the workflow and their life, and then validating with them like, hey, I thought about this workflow, does it work? And I guess some of the resources that's super helpful during the stage would be like a book called The Mom's Test, making sure you ask probing questions that allow you to understand deeply whether this is helpful, rather than be like, hey, is this product super helpful? Everyone can be so nice and be like, yeah, that's going to be great. And then when you actually build it, no one's going to download it and no one cares about it. So it's really easy. It's really important to actually ask probing questions, especially understanding how painful this problem is. Have they solved it? If they haven't really gone out of the way to try to solve it, maybe that's a concern, right? For us, it was the fact that everyone was trying to download WhatsApp and use it for clinical workflow, and they can potentially get penalized for that. And we knew there was a problem with pagers. So I think that's really important. As the company is scaling, I think the secondary portion is now figuring out how to capture that value. And so you're transitioning yourself away from product management. I mean, I still do a little bit of product management, but into sales portion, like building the foundation for sales. How do you acquire people into become interested, and how do you capture that value? How do you convince them that this is something worth paying for? And in Series A really is like, now you've sold it to maybe 5 or 10 customers. How do you become repeatable? So you can pitch a story to investors like, if you invest $1 million or $10 million, you can generate potentially $50 million based on whatever pipeline there is in terms of sales. And there's hopefully data around that too. So that's like the scalability part. Yeah.
Yeah, actually, that got me really curious about something. Two things that you mentioned earlier about, just like scale and also just like building out your product and how your role kind of changes as the company progresses. And I guess like when you're starting out, from like a smaller startup to like a bigger company, so this is like a two-part question. Like, first of all, how do you build out your team? Because I'm guessing like the first few people on your team are really important, play a really big role in how like the team works together, how you build your product, and also just like how you select and choose like your company culture. And the second part is like, as you've scaled and as you've grown a bit bigger, like how have you kept that culture that you had in the beginning?
Yeah, it's a great question. That's a very good question. It's hard. I would say, like for example, with our company, we went through 7 different co-founders in the initial stages. First year or so, we went through 7 different co-founders. Portions of it because it was a school project, and I was successful in convincing all my project mates that this should be a company. And I don't think everyone really understood what it is to build a company, the sacrifices you have to make. And people have different things in life they want. Some people went to do a PhD, some people took a big corporate job, and so that also changes too. And so you kind of have to play by ear. It's really important to have a diverse team for founders, especially. You can't really build a diverse company if you don't really have a diverse team. And so what that means is not just like the skin color, but really the thought process too. For me, for example, I'm very eager. I've got excitement that, I always want to change things. And I'm like pushing really fast. And then we have a physician co-founder who's a little bit more risk averse, coming from a healthcare background, understanding the healthcare dynamic and culture, right? And so on one hand, if we just like play all by his culture, then we probably wouldn't be anywhere. But if we all only play by my culture, we'll probably be burning our ship, and no healthcare company wants to touch us, and no hospital trusts us as well. So it's really important to have a diversity. And we've also brought on our CTO, who I've known since like grade 7, and he's great as well, and he's super, super smart from the engineering side. So it's really important to complement each other's weakness. The chief medical officer we have, who's one of our co-founders, the physicians, he's very professional. He's really good in terms of language, which I sometimes struggle with. So it's really important to complement each other. And then when you build the team, it's really important to recognize what you're good at and what you're bad at, and what you don't prefer to do as well. And so if you have resources and you can hire someone, you can recognize, okay, next person we need is a salesperson. Can I do that role effectively to take it to the next stage? Or is it better to hire someone so we can move a little bit faster? And some companies who raise a lot of money, they can quickly hire all the best people in different roles. The unfortunate reality is if you hire someone who is really, really good from another company, they might also not be the best person though to build that foundation. Because the difference between there's already a playbook, some people call it playbooks, like for example, sales playbook or marketing playbook or engineering playbook, where something has been created and is a process to follow, compared to you're building everything from scratch. And so there's two types of people sometimes, and some people can do both, but it's not often. And so sometimes you recognize that too, and you might make a bad hire. That just always happens. I guess my last advice is it's always important to try to do that role yourself, or someone in the founding team, because that way you know how to hire the person to replace you. And it's a little bit sad, like for me especially, where I do a role, I get decently good at it, and I have to replace someone, and now I have to do another role that I'm like terrible at again. But it's really important to do that because you know exactly who you're looking for.
So I think I forgot to mention this at the beginning, so this might be a good time. So for anybody who is on the live stream, if you feel like you have a question to ask Albert, you have the live chat. You also have, if you are on our Slack channel, please by all means post your questions. I'll make sure to hunt Albert down and then ask those questions from him. But apart from that, so there's something that you mentioned that kind of got me thinking, and that is the challenges, the hurdles that somebody would have. Do you think that there are basically different categories, and you could map these categories to different people based on their, let's say, characteristic or background? Or if I were to go back to the main topic of this call, which is going from academia to building a startup, do you think coming from academia, especially doing a master's or a PhD, is going to bring more obstacles or different types of obstacles for people who want to become a startup co-founder? Or is it just the same types of challenges and everybody has to go through them one by one if you decide to go through that journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. What's really interesting actually is there's actually a lot of incubators as well. I just want to mention this for anybody out there, where universities sometimes will have incubators dedicated to commercializing research. So the incubator we were part of was called UTest, which is University of Toronto Early Stage Technology Incubator. And that was actually primarily dedicated to researchers who are hoping to commercialize their research into actual companies. And that was super wonderful to be part of it. We were actually one of the few companies that didn't come out of research. And so I was actually exposed, and I was working at the same office with a lot of PhDs that, and some of them actually were able to sell their companies directly to other companies as well. I would say one of the challenging things probably is to learn how to sell. Very similar to me. I wouldn't say this is a problem just for researchers, but I would just say it's a problem, for engineers too, because we're kind of used to the fact that we just code and we build and people will come. But gone are the days where internet only has like 5 websites, right? You really need to learn how to pitch your value proposition. People don't really spend that much time anymore to like download something and play around with it unless they're convinced that they actually should press the download button anymore. And so I would say those are really, really important things to keep in mind for researchers. Also keeping in mind, I think one of the really important things when you're building a company is to separate ego. At one day, I'm not going to be the best CEO, and that's going to be a day where a company's going to replace me. Because as a company grows, my role and responsibility change, and therefore my fit might be different. I might not be the best CEO anymore. And so they have to recognize, maybe because I was able to write a great research paper, get it publicized, and get people to recognize how cool the technology is, might not be the best thing for me to actually be the CEO. It might be good, and I've seen this with research companies where they hire a business-focused CEO that are able to raise money from investors, are able to sell to customers as well, and able to hire too. And it also might not be something you're interested in. Some researchers really just love creating really innovative things, and they might take it from zero to research and getting something publicized and then be the technical advisor for the company, and then they step away. And that's totally fine. People have different comfort levels. So I don't think there's one way to build a company. If there was, building a company would be much easier, but I've seen all sorts of different ways people became successful. And that's also one of the reasons why when you're building a company, you get all these conflicting advice, because people have been successful in different ways in their own lives. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, and I think that's awesome, especially because a lot of our current, the people watching this webinar, I think, are in that space, and who are probably, some of them are probably like in the process of like building their own companies, or who are doing research and who are also trying to get into that space. So I know you mentioned earlier that there are a couple of things, a couple like challenges, a couple like lessons that you had learned when you were like building your company, and also you've been doing this for about like 5 years now, right? Like you started around 2016.
Mhm.
Um, I guess, is there anything like with what you know today and like with your experience today as CEO, is there anything that you would change or do differently if you were to build Hypercare again from scratch?
Yeah, there's there's so many things I would do differently. You're always hoping, like when you're building a company, that you don't make a mistake that's grave enough to take down a company. But making mistakes is honestly part of the process. One thing that's really important from building a company perspective is remembering that it's a marathon and not a sprint. And I think, especially in the beginning, I was so eager and excited that I was just sprinting from one thing to another, pulling all nighters all the time. And it really burns you out. And it's important to recognize that it takes a long time to be successful. I think many people think about, like, for example, Clubhouse, 1 year mediocre rise, but that doesn't typically happen. It takes a long time to build a good foundation. It takes a long time for people to recognize the value and get it to scale. So that's one thing I would probably, kind of reiterate is just making sure you keep yourself balanced. Like you have personal life, you're able to spend time with your family as well as working and not just going all at it. I think also another challenge for us anyways was that we had founders that was part-time for some time, and it's very difficult to win when you have founders part-time. And I totally understand sometimes there's financial limitations as well. But the challenges you're going to face is, for example, it's really hard for me as a CEO to sell to investors to invest in money when my founders didn't look as committed. Personally, I knew that it was financial concern, right? If they could do it, they would do it. But it's just really, really hard. And it's another excuse, it looks like, from an investor perspective. So that's going to be super helpful. Another thing that's really helpful, and it's not really something I learned, but something I guess I'm very grateful for, is to have co-founders. Because they challenge you. You need co-founders that challenge you, so then you can actually prevent you from making mistakes. But most of all, it's actually mental health. It's someone that you can rant about bad things that happen. If you're a solo founder, it's really hard to rant with someone. And it's very challenging from that aspect. And yeah, just like a hug or like a friend. And it's very hard, during COVID times to kind of build that bond, but that's really, really important as well. I think recently, as a company is scaling, and also because of COVID, it's really, really important during COVID times as a founder, as an executive, as a director, as a manager, to really make sure your well-being of your staff members is well received. I was very complacent, I would say, for a year and a half about having company activities, because I was always thinking, oh, in a month or two, COVID will be over. And we had a number of staff members leave, and they loved Hypercare's culture before COVID. But during COVID, they felt a little bit isolated. And it totally makes sense. When you're the only backend engineer, only iOS engineer, just coding on something day in and day out, you just essentially wake up, go to your desk next to your bed, work for a whole time, and go back to bed. And you don't maybe not even talk to any of your colleagues. And so it's really important to have game nights or anything to connect people together. Because at the end of the day, a lot of people who work for startups are looking for that culture portion, right? Like friends and family, that they create through their startup experience. So I think that's also one of the big learnings I had, to be honest. And I guess the last piece of healthcare is that it is very, very challenging. A lot take care of like security, privacy, but the social impact is amazing. And I think it's really important to find something you're very passionate about. If it wasn't for the fact that I was passionate about this problem, I would have given up so many times. It was ridiculously hard numerous times. And I think being passionate about something, it could be the opportunity itself, will keep you motivated when it's like tough times. Yeah.
So whatever you say just opens another thread in my head that I want to ask like 10 million new questions from you. But this one is mainly around, and I'm just thinking about this question. It's not something that I prepared for, so I have to think about it, live as I'm trying to find the words, and it's a Friday. It's been a long week, so bear with me.
No worries.
Maybe the question, or maybe it's a challenge that everybody, as a co-founder, as the founding member of a startup would have, and that is convincing people to have and keep having a skin in the game, without losing too much control. And control usually means equity, right? So you definitely have to let go of a little bit of that control as you're talking to investors, as you grow and scale and raise and whatnot. But within the team, other than equity and other than culture, how do you ensure, again, from a manager's perspective, which you mentioned earlier, how do you ensure that people keep putting that energy and having that skin in the game in the long run? It's not only for 4 months as a school project anymore, right? And we talked about people coming from academia and people being like preferring to work on something individually or maybe in a team of two, whereas here it really requires proper collaboration over the course of maybe a couple of years. And keeping that skin in this game and making sure that everybody is there for the long run is, I think, one of the challenges that I have personally faced before in the startup setting, on both ends, both on the co-founder and on the other side of the table. So what's your strategy? How do you try and convince your people to continue being happy with the time and the energy that they're putting in the startup without losing too much control, basically?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a very difficult question too, because there's a multiple reasons why someone could end up finding another opportunity or end up leaving the company. And I agree, like just giving them more equity or cash sometimes might not solve the problem. And I think this is where, when I was, one of the questions like, what role do you have to play? One of the roles really, as an executive, as a leader, as a manager, you have to play is like being a guidance counselor, like back in the school. You have to make sure you do your one-on-ones with your staff members and understand, A, what type of personality are they? And then B, what are they enjoying? What kind of work do they enjoy doing? What kind of work do they not enjoy doing? And you have to make sure that the work that they're doing right now, over time especially, is mostly work that they really enjoy doing. Like we have team members that have left because we didn't understand that. I didn't spend the time to understand that. And they end up working on things that just really absolutely hate. And over time, they're gonna burn out, because burnout is just not about number of hours they're working, right? Some people absolutely hate chasing people down. So if you build a culture where every time some task gets delegated out, you have to chase like 20 of your colleagues down, ping them multiple times to get task done, you're gonna leave, right? It doesn't outweigh the pros in this case. And so making sure what they understand in terms of tasks they don't enjoy doing, you minimize that. And you build a culture around that too. Making sure there's like a good work-life balance too. Like one of the things we try not to do now is book as many meetings as possible. In the past, we had a problem where a lot of people had a bunch of meetings that maybe doesn't necessarily need them to be at. And so they couldn't end up doing individual work during the day. And then they have to spend time after work to catch up all those individual work. And so we start implementing flow time where for Thursday, majority of Thursday, you can't really book a meeting. And that's really, really important, even for myself, right? Like for my mental health, being able to catch up on work, will also force users or force your staff members to be able to do work after hours. So those are kind of really important things that kind of fundamentally do that. And then another thing, which is very difficult from a startup perspective, is mentorship and growth. Fundamentally, people who join startups are looking to grow quickly, because that's what people come out with. Like, oh yeah, I've learned so much stuff, especially for myself. I've learned so much stuff in the matter of 5 years compared to working at a big company. The challenge would be, some people enjoy the unstructured learning and some people want to be mentored. And as a startup, it's important to try to recruit people who can potentially advise your team members, or you start hiring more senior people, like let's say a VP of engineering, that can actually mentor your staff members, because eventually your junior engineers are going to be like, I'm just going to find another company because I'm learning things by myself and I don't know if I'm doing the best way. And I think that's also really, really important. I think that those are kind of it. I'm probably not covering all the edge cases, but these are kind of things I've seen personally that hasn't worked out for us, and we learn from those and we implement new processes and new things. But yeah.
So actually, one thing that you mentioned earlier really struck me, especially when you talked about the whole like process of building out a startup, building out a team, pitching to investors, and basically going from this is like a project, like a project that we did in grad school, to something that we're now like really building out and is our like main like income stream. You know what I mean? So one thing that you mentioned was about like founders and like part time like founders. So my question is like the first one is what made you decide to do this full time and like take that like leap of faith that yes I'm gonna do this like full time, and then the second piece is like how did you deal with I guess like part time like founders or part time like partners, like what are like the pros and cons of that, and are there ways to work around folks who can only work part time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So your first, sorry, can you repeat your first question again?
Yeah, so the first one was really about what made you decide to do this like full time,
Oh, yes.
just like jump in, like all in. And then the second one is like, how do you deal with? Is there any like way to deal with like founders who are working part time, or what are like the pros and cons? Anything that you noticed as you were going through that?
Yeah, jumping from part time to full time is definitely very scary. I had the luxury of like I started working full time on this startup when I was halfway through my master's. My master, I felt like it was pretty easy. It was a research based master, so I was able to kind of do my startup full time for the most part. So there is like some sort of cushion. But after my master finished, I felt like I made enough progress to feel confident in terms of like my next stage that I'll learn enough. And at the end of the day, I felt like it wasn't very risky. And I think people who are, especially in technology or doing technology companies, um, the risk is very minimal because at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out, you can find a job at Google or Microsoft or something and have a six-figure job. Yeah, maybe during that period of time, potentially you're not making as much as you could have, but it is a backup plan. It's not like when a company fails, it's going to take me forever to find a job. Also, the skills you build, and this is where I thought about, financial outcome short term versus like growth in myself. I felt like the skills that I would develop while building a company will make me very employable and should allow me to be elevated as a potential recruitment if I was going down the path as well. And lastly, I really enjoyed what we were doing. I just really enjoyed it. I felt, I have had opportunities in the past to do startups. I had opportunities where one of the projects I wanted to convert into a startup, and those fizzled away because I fundamentally didn't connect with the problem. And so I just stopped kind of working on it. It just kind of fizzled out. I'm sure all of us had projects where we kind of got excited for a bit of time. Maybe it was a technology, and once after we kind of built it, we're like, it's okay. And then you kind of stop working on it. But I fundamentally was very, very passionate about it, and that kind of kept me into it. And I was also very optimistic. It's a little bit naiveness that you think it's like, oh, it's almost there, it's gonna scale, and you keep working on it, and then kind of something bad happens, but I'm almost there, and you keep working on it. And so that's also really helpful. For part-time co-founders, what's really challenging is that they have a full-time job and they're dedicating a lot of time doing something. And I'll give experiences like my CTO was that he was programming throughout the whole day, and they would come back home and now he gets to program even more. And when you're doing the same thing for the entire day, it can take a lot out of you. So there's gonna be days where he might come back home and he just doesn't feel like working for the rest of the day, and that's totally fine. The problem with a startup is everything's moving very fast, right? You're trying to close customers. You might have some promises you have to make to close your first customer who literally don't trust you a lot because you have no reputation. So you have to build that reputation. And for us, it was very difficult. We shipped out a lot of things really delayed because we only had one engineer. So it was him. And so if he got sick or he didn't feel like working, things could be delayed for a week or two. And that's how you kind of destroy your credibility. So it's really challenging. It was also really helpful to kind of talk about, very similar to probably any serious relationship like a marriage, to talk about what's the next step, right? And so for me, I understood once we raise our first fundraising round, he will come join us full time. Obviously, investors will be skeptical. Investors will be like, well, if he was willing to join full time, why can't he join full time right now? And you have to kind of explain the financial situation, and then they probably do not care. And so it's kind of like a chicken egg problem. And thankfully, you just have to break it somehow. And I was thankfully able to break that. The physician co-founder who's part-time, that one's a little bit easier. He's doing physician work at the hospital, and he comes back and he's doing completely different work, which is really exciting for him. Now the challenge is really, setting up meetings a little crazy. Like, I work from 8 to 4 or 8 to 6 or whatever it is. 6 p.m. I end, and then we have a midnight meeting because he's done his shift at the hospital. So a little bit challenging from that front, but also really exciting because over time, as the company has been scaling, he's been taking minimal shifts now. It just takes only weekend shifts. And so now you can be part of daily meetings, and it's really nice to have your co-founders there. And also, it's been really nice to remove myself from a lot of meetings now. It's a little bit sad in one way where I don't know every little thing that's happening in the company, but in another way, it allows us to scale quickly because I'm not the bottleneck for decisions anymore. And I trust my co-founders to make those decisions completely. So yeah, those are hopefully some little tidbits.
There indeed. So, one more probably very challenging obstacle that I see, and I wanted to kind of get your feelings about it, is you talked about mentorship and how it's really important for a lot of team members who join later on. And then we also talked about the fact that you have to find this point of compromise between the co-founders. So let's just focus on an imaginary company, ABC Limited. I don't want to call specifically about Hypercare, but because your CTO, in and out for a long time. But at an imaginary company, let's say that the CTO or maybe even the COO or the CEO, they're not really that experienced. For a majority of them, at least that's the case.
Yeah.
And then at some point you scale and you want to go and bring in somebody who is, I don't know, probably going to eventually grow into a director of engineering or VP or something, and they have to report back to your CTO or the other departments, marketing, operations, whatnot. That's another thing, another challenge that I see that I don't know if anybody really has a solution for it. Like, how do you convince somebody who has 10 years of experience to come and report and get mentorship, report to and get mentorship from somebody who only has 2 or 3, just because they have, more experience in this specific startup and they have equity and whatnot. I think that's a real challenge, and I have talked to a lot of startups, specifically in GTA, in Kitchener-Waterloo, in Calgary, BC as well. And everybody seems to have that problem, and I think the only solution that is universal is we will only do that when we have enough money so that we could go and basically, convince those super experienced people to join our team. But in the meantime, how do you usually scale? Is it scaling the team only based on the promises of the future and only hiring super junior people, or have you actually managed to bring and onboard somebody who is more experienced but is willing to work with the team and share their experiences?
Yeah, that's a good question. That is definitely very challenging. I would say, I feel like it again goes back to the stages of the company. In the pre-seed stage, I can just remember back in the days, we'll just whoever wants to work at a startup, we'll pick them up. Like if they're down to work and down to be very cheap, we'll just pick them up. And they could be in school still, we'll just all hands on deck. And it was definitely very chaotic, right? You have people who might not be very committed to a startup. They just want a startup experience. They're part-time as a student. And over time, we realized that it's a lot of work to train people like that. It's a lot of work to train them. They're not very committed to the startup. And over time, we kind of move from, let's say, part-time junior people to intermediate people who are full-time. And in order to recruit them, thankfully, one of the things that people talk about is your rate of growth as a founder or as a director or as an executive or as a manager has to be greater than the growth of the company. And we're not a super fast growing company. And thankfully, over the 5 years, I would say I've been growing enough for people to be satisfied, and still I am trying to grow even more. But it's important to keep ramping up. And for example, my CTO, he's being able to grow fast enough that people who join, who may even have a bit more experience than him, respect him enough for him to be the manager. And I just have a lot of people who, who are co-ops, for example, leave the organizations. I've never learned more than at Hypercare because, Umar, who's my CTO, has taught me so much. So I think that's one part, is making sure you keep growing. And, for me, especially as a CEO, I'm mentored by a lot of really very accomplished people in Toronto and San Francisco, our investors, our advisors, and especially people in healthcare. So I kind of learn through them. and hopefully I can ramp up also as a CEO, and therefore people kind of respect me a little bit more. In terms of hiring more experienced people, I think this is where you have to show a little. Everything's about de-risking, right? When you like raise money, you're like trying to de-risk a company. Here is when you're trying to trying to hire more experienced people, you have to de-risk enough for the person to join the company. So either you show that you're paying them a ton of money, and so you're de-risking that from the financial aspect, or B, you're showing that your company is growing so fast. So de-risking the opportunity, like worst case scenario, you can find another job if this company doesn't work out. But right now we're growing like rocket ship, right? And then C, they have to also be passionate about the company. And I can give probably 2 examples. We're able to hire a very experienced salesperson, 12 plus years, who's our director of VP and business development. And he actually reached out to us. He saw Hypercare on the news just growing, and he was able to reach out to us, pitched himself, talked about why he was so interested in Hypercare. And I think once you have someone more experienced than you in those positions, you have to remember you have to give them the opportunity to show them why you hired them in the first place. And so once we hired them, for example, and the person we hired was Ishmael, I gave him the responsibility of actually owning the entire department. I can advise things that goes on, but ultimately it's their decision. And it's really important to do that, because you're hiring someone that should be a lot better than you, and you have to demonstrate that you're comfortable with that. And I think that's really difficult for founders. You've done everything. You've built that department from the foundation. You sold to the first 5 customers. You kind of want to handle sales still. But it's really important to make sure you're like, hey, you know what? We've hired someone better than me, and that's why they're owning it. And now you move on to another department. And so you have to build that respect as well. And I think that's also where it's really important to do that role in the beginning. If I had him 4 years ago, he probably would call me a fool. I didn't even know the basic terminology. I've sold to no hospital system so far. But when I hired him, I already sold to multiple hospital systems. It was much easier to have a communication around the same language about sales and what the next step is, and having a shared vision as well. So I think that's really, really important. But fundamentally, hiring experienced people is super important for the company. And I think some people delay it for a long time, and it's gonna basically have some debt around that, because junior engineers or junior people are not going to really learn, and you're not going to have an experienced person who's willing to challenge you in terms of how things should be run, and the company will not scale to a point where it should be. Yeah.
So I think that's really awesome advice. And I think one thing that you kind of touched on was like the mentorship piece. You talked about how, you have to be mostly like growing faster than how fast your company is growing as like a founder, as a CEO. So when you were looking for mentors or like coaches or like advisors, how did you go about finding those people? And was there ever a time when, you got conflicting advice from your multiple mentors? And if so, how did you deal with that? And how did you decide which path to take?
Yeah. Sorry, what's the first part of the question? Sorry, it's a Friday.
Yeah, how do you like find your mentors? How do you find a mentor in this space? How do you build a relationship, and then how do you deal with conflicting advice?
Yeah, so funny enough, I think the advisors we end up bringing to Hypercare, or even for myself, has been like various different stages of the company where I'm like seeking some sort of answer. So let's say I'm struggling to scale sales. I'm not entirely sure how to even sell to a hospital system. And that's where I got, through my connections, you kind of like, as founders, you end up creating a huge network. And that's one of the things that you'll recognize is like founders have a lot of people they're connected to. Maybe not as deep as some people, but you have a lot of people. And through the connections you have, I got connected to, for example, Joshua Lee, which has been one of my most helpful advisor to date. And he's been fabulous. He's scaled a healthcare software company across Canada and US. And he done it like just a few years before that. So I think that's really important, is to find someone who's just a few years ahead of you, because if it's like 10 years ahead, they're not going to remember anything that they've done when it was like 10 years ago. So it's really important to do that. And it's also really important, just very similar to like a marriage. On first date, it's like not just like, hey, let's just get married. It's, it's like repeated coffee meetings. And over time, you're like basically this person's advisor. You build a relationship up, and over time too, who the best person to ask for different questions. If I have a question about maybe sales, might ask someone who have done it in healthcare sales. If I have a question about privacy, for example, I have this privacy firm that I know and love, and I always ask them about new questions about HIPAA when it comes out, for example. And so it's really important to build a network of people that really mitigates your weakness and your experience and knowledge that you don't have, and you know how to manage them as well. It's a lot of work actually to manage advisors, because you have to keep them up to date on the company, how it's going. So it's important to send cadences of emails, like how the companies are going, so they have a background information. It's important to prep them for the meeting so they know exactly what you're struggling with, so they can actually be more specific in their advice as well. And then lastly, when you talked about conflicting advice, that happens all the time, and it's really hard because you're an inexperienced founder that has a lot of experienced people who have different advice, and they're all very successful. And so I don't know anything. How am I supposed to choose which one's the best advice? And I think what's really important here, and this is something called mentor whiplash, and I've suffered through them, especially in the beginning of Hypercare, where I would go into one meeting and come up like, guys, actually, we're not doing this anymore. We're doing something else. And then next meeting, like, wait, guys, we're not doing something else. And then everyone ends up hating you, the CEO, for changing direction like 1,000 times for no apparent reason other than I took a meeting and they recommended something else. So it's really important to absorb that, put it down, someone recommend this, put it down on Excel sheet, and think about where they're coming from, right? So if someone is in healthcare devices, saying like maybe go through, I don't know, FDA regulation, you have to kind of go back like, wait, am I a software company or a device company? Like just remember where the people are coming from, how they're successful, and then see how that applies to your company. And then always remembering that you are the best person to make a decision on a company because you know the most. Like no matter how much time you spend with advisors, it's very difficult to give them all the information that you have. And so you take the advice, think about your own experience, and think about how to combine that together. And that's really, really it. And I mean, also with advisors, what I really enjoy doing is getting stories out of them, because with stories, it makes it a little bit easier to apply to yourself as well. Yeah. Also, just enjoyable overall.
This was good. I think we probably need another 3 or 4 hours to get too deep into everything, but we're getting closer to the mark of the hour that we have with you. I really appreciate the time that you took off of your busy schedule, especially it's a Friday. So Fridays are super important days for startups, especially in North America. So I just wanted to maybe wrap up by asking you one final question, that is with respect to the what's next for Hypercare. Are you scaling right now? I mean, we have audience members who are probably interested in knowing whether or not there are opportunities. If there are, you could talk about them. If you're talking about raising or anything else, we'd really like to know what's going on in terms of Hypercare. What is it now? 3.0 or 4.0? However you define it.
Oh yeah, so we are, we're now international, so super happy about this. So last quarter, we landed 4 hospital systems, and our first one in the US. And that was our best quarter yet. We doubled our revenue, which was super happy for us. And it's a little bit unfortunate, during COVID, it's really hard to celebrate the wins. We had a fabulous quarter. We're live in 73 healthcare organizations now. One of our, next, I would say 12 to 24 months is really scaling into the US even more. So capturing more hospitals in the US. So international growth. As much as we love Canada, one of the things people have to recognize when they build a company is that America is a 10 times bigger market. And that's one of the things I probably regret a lot as making a mistake as a CEO, is how comfortable I was in Canada, and I didn't think about expansion for a very long time. I kept putting it off. It's really important to actually think about America, because most investors are from America, so they want to see you in America. And as much as you can say like this company applies to America, they want to see it happen, not just talk about it. So I would say that's really, really important. Second thing is, for us, we've sold to 73 healthcare organizations. Now it's showing a repeatable process. Everything should be like numbers, right? How many people come in from the leads, and how many people go in this next stage, and next stage, and next stage. And also having a good process around marketing. How do we capture leads as well? So those are kind of things we're building to make sure we're ready for a Series A if we go down that route, or we can be completely self-sustaining if we wanted to as well, which is really exciting for me. We're hiring engineers. We're hiring 2 back-end engineers. We're hiring a front-end engineer. We're hiring a customer success person. It's been a lot of scale. I think last year we had 4 people at the same time. and now we have 14 full time, and now we're hiring like another 4 full time. So it's really exciting. I can't wait until COVID is a little bit better, because most of the people in the company have never met each other, which is very unfortunate, to say the least. I have never met them, and I was, this is probably the last story I would probably share, but I signed a really nice office March of last year. Renovated myself, painted with my girlfriend, set up a nice cafe style table made of solid wood. That's how I got into woodworking. So excited. It was right next to all the nice coffee shops and very hip. And we used it for 2 weeks, and that was it. Paid a year of rent. And so I'm really excited to get another office once COVID is a little bit better, because I recognize how important it is for people to feel connected. Connected is so important, especially during this time. So yeah, great to be here. And honestly, thank you so much for having me. It's great to just talk about my, Hypercare, and life and stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. And we were so excited. I definitely learned a lot. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and for your advice today.
No worries. Yeah, if anyone's out there who has any questions or anything, feel free to add me on LinkedIn and just directly DM me a question. I don't know if I can get to all the questions, but I'll try my best. But yeah, feel free to do that.
Absolutely, yeah. And if we get questions, I'll forward them to you as well. I also wanted to thank you again for the time that you spent with us. We are going to be back with another episode, again, same time, every Friday, 2:30 Eastern. So please check our LinkedIn channel, subscribe to our YouTube channel, be in touch with us. We have a Slack. We will want to get you, on board so that we could have a lot of conversations offline as well. And then finally, so we're not there yet to have sponsors, so there's a little bit of a shameless promotion for myself. If anybody is in the machine learning engineering domain and you really want to, team up with some cool people and start working on some challenging problems, it's not yet a paid thing, but we're trying to solve some problems in the machine learning engineering domain and research as well. So take a look at our LinkedIn page for the logo that you can see up there, Federate AI. Our website is down. It's going to come up soon, but check us on LinkedIn. Make sure to follow, Albert on LinkedIn as well, and also follow Hypercare. I'm sure that there's going to be a point in time very soon, hopefully, that I will send my resume to Albert. But in the meantime, he's hiring, so please go ahead and check their careers page, and hopefully, out of this conversation, there might be a career opportunity for some of our audience members as well. With that, really looking forward to having you, Albert, maybe in another season, maybe a couple quarters from now, to talk more, in terms of scaling and, going deeper in terms of mentorship. And for everybody who was, live with us today, please join us again next week, same time. And enjoy the rest of your day and have a great weekend.